Hello and welcome back to part 2 of part 2. If you stumbled across this video first, take a look at part 1 of part 2, which was posted shortly before this one to get up to date on this project. And if you've not seen part 1 of this project series, that is the very first video of the project, not part 1 of part 2, go watch that one first, as it will tell you how I went about designing the Stargate. While this may technically be part 3 of the project series, I ended up wanting to call both this and the last video part 2 because that was the milestone I had originally set out to do part 2. Got that? Good. With that confusion out of the way, let's get on with it. When I left you before, I was laid to cutting the frame parts of the Stargate itself. The Durlin plastic was bolted down to the honeycomb bed and the laser toolpath did its job. Everything seemed to go well and looked correct. I designed jigsaw keys into each half of the gear, and after I soldered the two halves together, I used my soldering iron to melt and weld the two halves together, so there was a good solid bond. I then prepped and primed the symbols and started attaching them to the gear. After drilling a tapered recess into the back of the plastic gear, I used screws to help secure the symbols, and I also used expanding polyurethane glue to add rigidity and to help hold everything together. After everything had set, I then painted the symbols, starting with a grey base colour and then using a sponge to add a stony effect, using other greys, whites and some earth colours. On the show, the Stargate has circular engravings all over the studio set model. These almost look like cracks, but they appear to be perfect circles. Instead of engraving my model, I opted to pencil in these markings using a dark pencil and a round plastic party bowl. I then assembled the rest of the frame around the gear, being sure to fit the idlers correctly. Once assembled, I tried spinning the dialing ring and it appears to be okay, though I could feel it wasn't moving quite as freely as I would have liked. At this point, I joined the two halves of the pedestal and used a stepper motor and a speaker to form a bridge to hold the two halves in place. I will later weld the two halves together so all the stress isn't going to be put on the speaker and the motor. And after some modification to help the frame fit into the slot of the pedestal, and after I bolted it in, I discovered that the dialing ring was badly binding and wouldn't freely turn as I span it, only for it to turn a bit freer every 90 degrees. Right away I could tell what the problem was. My dialing ring was ever so slightly oval and not a perfect circle. It turns out, while I did calibrate my laser cutter to be accurate in the X and Y by 200mm, it turns out that still isn't accurate enough, and my X was falling slightly short on larger pieces. Now this oval isn't the end of the world, but it is causing the idler gears to lock up. While talking to a friend on the laser cutter scene, they recommended I replace my idler gears with runners instead, using the same Durlin plastic. So instead of meshing against the idler gear, the main gear would glide across the runners. So after removing the idlers and cutting some runners and modifying the parts of the frame so they would fit, the dialing ring was now freely moving. But because of this slight oval shape, the dialing ring does lift and dip by about 1, maybe 2mm, and this may prove to be an issue down the line, but it's hard to tell for now. If it does come to it, I'll recalibrate the laser cutter, buy more Durlin plastic and recut the parts, and hopefully I'll be able to take off the symbols of the old gear and reattach them to the new gear without damaging them. It was time to get my resin parts done. The mould looked good, and so I started to do some resin injections. This was all the way back in the beginning of spring. I did have footage of me doing my first mould injections, but I've lost it, so you'll have to settle for this shot of a later version of the mould. More on that shortly. Like the silicone, I wanted to make my resin last, so to help with that and maybe help with the strength, I added graphite powder. Doing this has 3 extra benefits, or at least it should have. The first benefit is to give the resin parts a nice graphite look. The second is the graphite adds a level of reduced friction, so if the dialing ring was to rub against this, it should cause less damage. The third is using fillers are said to help reduce shrinkage. Okay, I wasn't too worried about strength, as the resin from Easy Composites is a tough resin, and in that I can't fault it at all. In fact, I can see this being a really useful resin in certain situations. With the resin pure, I found it to be very difficult to break this resin. It tends to deflect before breaking, and this takes up a lot of effort. The graphite did make it a little more brittle, but I still ended up with a really strong piece, perhaps even as stronger than ABS. While in this video I am using a fairly inaccurate scale, I did move on to a new digital scale shortly after taking this footage. I made my resin, and because of the short pot life of only 7 minutes, I pre-mixed one of the halves with graphite first and then mixed in the other half of the resin, so not to waste time mixing in graphite while the resin started to kick. Once it's all mixed in good, making sure to scrape the sides, I used a big 100mm syringe, sucked up the resin, making sure to get as little air as possible, and then letting that right to the top of the syringe if I did get any air. I placed the syringe in the injection sites on my mould and injected the resin slowly, giving the resin time to flow and fill into all the details. And once the resin started coming out of the air trap holes, I knew that part had been filled. Once all the parts were injected, I pushed out the last bit of resin into my mixing cup and left the head of the syringe in there as well to set, so I could easily clean it and remove the hardened resin later. Doing this, I was able to get a good 10 or more mixes before I had to change the syringe. This resin is said to set within 2 hours, but truth be told, I found that it takes a little longer, so after 3 or 4 hours I would pull the part out of the silicone and cut the sprues of the resin that went up the air traps. And got on with the next mix. It took me a few attempts to figure out the correct amount to mix up, so there was enough resin to fill the 3 parts, but not so much resin that I was wasting a lot. I needed what resin I had to be enough to make all the parts, as it's not cheap. After everything was cast, I picked the best of the bunch, cleaned them up and gave them a prime coat, right away noticing a problem. Nearly every part had air bubbles clinging to the various details of the parts of the mould. It turns out this wasn't normal trapped air in the resin that I injected. It was surface tension bubbles, meaning that the resin didn't flow into the details correctly. In an attempt to somehow salvage this, I first started with the greebled outer ringed parts. I managed to pick a few that had the least bubbles and started drip feeding resin into the bubbles and curing it under a UV light. After painting and doing dry brush effect to bring up the edges highlights, most of the bubbles ended up being pretty well hidden. While only the highest of scrutiny would spot something was not quite right. But for the rest, all the front and back faces, because of the sharp details and the relatively flat plane and even surfaces, I couldn't get it looking right. By this time, with so much going wrong, I took a break from the project, giving myself some breathing room and time to focus on some other projects I had lined up, like my subscriber counter, and another project that I'll be making a video about early in the new year. By the time I returned to the Stargate, we were well into summer. I had done more research into the surface tension issue and found that dusting the molds with talcum powder can break the surface tension, so I gave this a try. I mixed up the last of the resin I had from before, just enough to do 2 batches of the front and back faces, dusted my molds and injected the resin, and it kinda worked. Right away I could see no more bubbles caught in the corner of the details, but I had noticed that some of the silicone had started to come away from the mould and embed into the resin. For the sake of testing, I used up my very last bit of resin to do another mould pull, and indeed, while no new bubbles appeared, I saw my silicone mould had started to degrade quite badly. Now, by this point, it's been several months since I did my first round of resin pulls, and when I felt across the details of the silicone mould with my fingers, I could tell it felt brittle and dry. I can only assume that the 12 to 15 pulls that I had done before had damaged the silicone and in its downtime had somehow dried out. But the test did work, only now instead of just buying more resin, I needed to buy more silicone and remake the mould as well. By this point, the project had started to get very expensive, and every pound I had to spend more on it really started to hurt. I first went with the idea of resin casting because I thought it would be the cheaper option to resin printing. While printing resin is more expensive compared to casting resin, when you throw in the cost of silicone and all the other materials, it ends up costing a lot more. But I still only had the Anycubic Photon, and printing all the parts on this was out the question. I had to bite the bullet and just order more resin and silicone. By this point I had probably spent about £200 on the project, and I was about to spend yet another 60 quid for resin and silicone. In fact, I'm certain if I really tallied up everything I've spent on this project, it might make my eyes water. Already this project was starting to cost me more time and money than I really wanted to put in, but literally I was in this for a penny, in for a pound. I'm committed. I'm going to do this. I will succeed. Nothing can stop me now. Except everything else that went wrong. The moulding and casting materials turned up fairly quickly, and when I found a good time, I started building the new moulds doing the same as I'd done before, getting my original parts, floating them on plasticine before filling the base and making a mould box around it. This time I only made a mould for the front and back faces, as I felt all the correcting work I had done before on the greeble rings actually ended up being a good enough job for the model. I did my silicone in two parts again, with the virgin silicone capturing all the details and with the stiffer phyllite filled silicone adding the rigidity. And again, taking the box apart, cleaning up the negative and placing air trap vents, this time making sure I used enough hot glue to make sure that the sticks stayed in place, before re-gluing the box sides and doing my 2-part pour of silicone here as well. I then spent the next 2 weeks casting all the parts. And in the end I had a bunch of good enough resin parts, though be it still with having a few odd bubbles here or there. But it was something I could work with. I cleaned up the parts, dremeled off the bulges left by the glue I used for the air traps, and then spent a long time painting up the parts, taking a similar approach to what I did with the symbols, only this time I used grey automotive primer before airbrushing on my grey base colour, followed by stippling a stone-like cloudy texture with a sponge. And truth be told, it looked amazing. Around this time, I had also needed to get my light up chevrons made. A little early in the year, I started searching for orange translucent resin, but because of the global pandemic, the options for coloured resin have all but disappeared, so I ended up looking for some resin pigments and dyes. And as these were quite cheap, I ordered a few online from different sellers, including an amber resin dye normally used for casting resin. The Chinese dyes really took a long time to turn up, and when they did turn up, these dyes had mostly dried up and gone bad. They also really stank. I did manage to get a refund for these, but the amber dye I got from the local resin supplier was a little too bright, so I had to do a little bit of experimenting. I tried mixing up the transparent resin I had with some black printer resin, so slightly darkening it up. I then added some amber and a little bit of the still liquid red dye from the pack I had ordered that had mostly dried up. And I felt I made a decent looking resin that should light up correctly when lit with the LEDs. I poured this into my printer vat and started printing the chevron, triangles and crystals. And the print worked. They looked great. I was really worried the dye wouldn't be compatible and might leave the prints sticky or soft after cleaning them post curing, but no, they really did come out looking like a good finished printed part. This is actually one of the few experiments in this whole project that actually worked first time. I painted up the chevron triangles, being sure to mask off the bits I wanted to keep transparent, and then soldered and glued in the LEDs into the spaces I made on the back. Everything was now ready. I was getting really excited about assembling this thing and finally getting on with making a video to update everyone on the project. So here was my original plan. I wanted to get the Stargate assembled and roughly painted before making a part 2 video, so this was my milestone. This was something I originally wanted to do by early summer, but because of all the troubles I've had previously with the casting resin and then having to take time off it to save up to buy more resin, this project really had gone long overdue. And by late September going into October, I was starting to get to the stage where I could finally put all of this together. But that was just not to be. I should have realised this much earlier in the summer, as around the time I was making the second lot of resin parts, I took my greeble ringed parts and tried to fit them on the frame of the Stargate. And simply put, they did not fit. I had to get my Dremel and widen the slot that went over the frame. I also had to make the holes where the keys went into the frame wider so they could fit. And so it was at this point I started to realise my resin parts had shrunk a little. And after dremeling all the greeble ring parts and fitting them to the gates, none of the parts lined up or met where they should have. They left large gaps where they should have been flush. At this point I should have stopped everything I was doing with the resin, but I was at my home stretch and I wanted to get this done. So, like the idiot Boris Johnson, I still ploughed ahead with this stupid oven-baked ready plan, knowing there would be problems. I had hoped, while not perfect, I would be able to fit everything and still have a working gate. I had hoped that while I may have had to get a bit hacky with the Dremel in some of the key slots, I had still given my design enough tolerance for it to work. But all my hopes were dashed and I was wrong. After winding in some key slots in my resin parts and tried forcing the parts together on my frame, and like before, nothing fit. While I did manage to jam some parts together, it ended up binding the dialing ring, and the greeble parts on the back of the frame simply would not fit behind the chevron frame parts, as they had slightly curved up, and I may have made a mistake when I glued them on my original part before making the mould, so they were also slightly out of alignment. It was this time I had to accept the cold lingering dread I was feeling for the past few months. All my resin parts have shrunk, and shrunk so much that they simply would not work. At this point I had to walk out to a deserted part of the countryside and let out a primal scream. On returning, I sat down and had a think on what to do. By this point I had spent far too much money on this project, and the prospect of spending up to £100 on buying yet even more casting resin and silicone to try experimenting to find more stable resin was utterly gut-wrenching. So this was not going to happen. And there was no way I could print all these parts on the photon printer. In my mind I had two options, but only one of these were realistic and viable at the time. Option 1, jam all the parts onto the frame and just have a static Stargate model and be done with it. This was by far the most realistic option for me, and by this point I was so done with this project I was leaning very hard onto this. Option 2 was to somehow wait and save up to buy a large format resin printer, such as the Elegoo Saturn or the Anycubic Mono X. Because of the larger build area, I will be able to print the front and back faces quickly, complete with the greeble ring section attached, as they would lay flat on the build plate and I would not need to print these parts tall. And because I would print these parts flat, I would be able to remove any possibility of any shrinkage or warping that could occur when printing tool. But as my money was tight and I missed out on the early bird offers a few months ago, this option didn't seem like something I could do right now. I'm hoping to sell a few bits and pieces come the new year, and so I considered buying one of these once the prices and stocks have settled, as I would certainly make good use of this printer for this and other future projects. But New Year was still a good while away yet, and I'm currently still only working on the stuff I wanted to sell. By this point I was super fed up of this project, and to add an extra kick to the guts on the situation, someone else had just released a video on their work in Stargate that included an infinity mirror, and it looked amazing. It really is a great build, so a massive kudos to them. I was ready to give up on this and just go with option 1. At least then I would have a good enough looking Stargate and I could then move on with a whole lot of other projects I now have on my to-do list. I decided to take a couple of weeks break, gather my thoughts, spend a little time working on a different project and then come to a final decision. And it's a good thing I did too. We're now up to a couple of weeks ago. I decided to search up on the two large format printers I had already mentioned. The Elegoo Saturn was still out of stock and no indication when it will come back, nor what price it would eventually settle on. And when googling, I only found the Amazon listing for the Anycubic Mono X selling for around £860. But by chance, I thought to check Anycubic's AliExpress store to see what their prices they might be selling it there. And I'm bloody glad I did. Now, I missed out on the AliExpress's single sale by a few days, but Anycubic was still carrying on with the follow-up sale. I have no idea if this printer was being sold for cheaper during the original sale, but the listing was for an EU warehouse printer, but with this sale and after a discount coupon, it came to £480 with free delivery. My jaw dropped. I think this may have actually been cheaper than the early bird deal back in summer. And with it being in the EU, I didn't have to worry about any import or VAT charges getting it into the UK, at least for now. I had to put my thinking cap on and make a decision. I go on a lot about how I don't have money to spend, and for the most part, this is true. I'm unemployed and on benefits, but I have over the years managed to save up a little money which I keep aside for emergencies. Things like if I needed a lump sum of cash to put down for a deposit on a flat, that kind of thing. It's not a lot of money, and I've had to dip into this money a few times in the past, including for this Stargate project. As stupid as that might be, I've had to decide whether I should dip into this money again to pay for this printer, and after a few hours thinking about it, I bit the bullet and placed an order for this printer. It wasn't an easy choice, and many of you may think this was a foolish thing to do, and if these were normal times, I would totally agree with you and I would not have ordered this printer. But my reasoning for getting this printer now is fairly simple. As long as Anycubic deliver my order before the new year, I'm only paying £480. After the new year, not only would the discounts be gone and the printer would likely be up around £800, I would also have to pay UK VAT and import duty on top of that, which would send this printer easily over £1,000. As Anycubic are stocking in EU locations and not the UK. Thank you, Brexit, you complete and utter batshit insane cluster. So we've now caught up to where I am with this project. The plan is to go over my design a little in CAD, maybe add some extra tolerances where I can, and do some test prints with the new printer once it arrives. And if everything looks good, I'll print the rest of the parts and start assembling the Stargate. If I have learned anything from this project, it's to not give any ETA on when my next video may be. So I will kindly ask that if you're not already, please consider subscribing and click the bell icon. That way you'll be notified when I release any updates on this project and any other project videos. And as I've already mentioned, these projects are not cheap for me to make. I don't make any profit from my projects or videos, and truth be told, I make a loss. I do these projects because they keep me active and my mind engaged, and because people seem to enjoy my videos. I would not have been able to make it even this far without the support I have already received through Patreon and GoFundMe. If you want to help support me and fund my builds, please consider signing up to my Patreon or make a one-off donation through GoFundMe. The links are in the description. All the money received goes straight towards materials for the project. They really do make a difference. Thank you for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe have learned something from my failures, as I really do feel that even in failure there is something to gain from it. So till next time, as always, take care, stay safe and goodbye.